she saw me with tape on my hands practicing kipping pull-ups, and she's like, why are you doing this? Like, your hands are obviously hurt. Why are you continuing to hurt them more? And I said, it's CrossFit. You wouldn't understand. They say check your ego at the door, but I think it's actually the opposite of that, because everyone is so egotistical about their score on the whiteboard that they're willing to forfeit their technique, and they don't even give a shit about the training effect. They just want to make sure they have the fastest score. Don't try to be the best at everything, but pick the things that you're kind of uniquely talented or have a unique knowledge of, and try to be the best within that scope. Physical culture is not just about how you look. Physical culture is about being able to be a virtuoso across all expressions of physicality. So I wouldn't want an athlete to not be able to run a mile just because they want to look good. That's not Thundrbro. Thundrbro is about having both together.
Okay, Dave, we're live on the podcast. How you doing, man?
I'm good. Hey, thank you so much for having me on, Sean. It's an honor to be here.
It's really great to have you on. Like you said, it's not always easy to schedule those, but we finally made it work. So you said you're back in Colorado for a little bit right now for a gym opening, correct?
Yeah, we're back in Colorado. We moved away from here about a year ago to Florida, which was a wonderful move for us, but we still have so many friends that we love and miss here. And one of them is actually opening up a really cool facility up in the mountains, kind of near, they call it the I-70 corridor, where all the ski resorts are, Vail and Copper and Breckenridge. And he's opening up a gym out here called Mountain Barbell, which is going to probably be the one and only serious lifting gym out here in the mountains, you know. So Camille and I came out. We're going to be hanging out and having fun at his launch party, and maybe filming some content at the gym and just broing out with our friends. And I hear that he has a lot of people coming in, different types of fitness influencers and personalities that are going to come join. So it should be a fun party.
Sounds like a lot of fun. Talk about talk about your move to, actually, before you talk about your move, for the three people that don't know who you are, Dave, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself? Let's start with that.
I don't even know where to start. I guess I've been a lifelong athlete. You know, I was a professional baseball player for quite a long time, and then fell into strength sport and, strongman, powerlifting, and then eventually CrossFit. And CrossFit took me just completely in a different direction in my training career. I competed at the CrossFit Games for a while, but more so, I think I'm better known as just being a coach and educator. I worked for CrossFit for 10 years, teaching courses and seminars, and coached a lot of athletes, including my wife, who went on to win the CrossFit Games. And since then, we've both collaborated in really doing a lot of online training, probably since about 2014 was when we started. And it's evolved to the point now where I'm the owner, founder, and president of Thundrbro, which is a large online training community of, frankly, a lot of CrossFit athletes who are trying to bridge the gap between performance and aesthetics. And what we do is we blend advanced bodybuilding concepts with functional movements using minimal equipment, and really exploring a new ground where we're really interested in developing physicality, but not just being display models only, being able to use your fitness outside the gym, but also getting to wear that work on your body and doing things like competing in bodybuilding shows and still maintaining a good level of general physical preparedness, which is really cool on both ends for a lot of CrossFitters who are not necessarily doing it because they want to be the fittest person on earth, but really they just want to look good and, feel good. And a lot of bodybuilders who are looking to, maybe able to train a bit more athletically and break things up a little bit so that it's not quite so myopic. I am just a seeker of information. I like to listen and steal from awesome coaches and try to translate that into context with our athletic population. And I love education. Camille and I travel around doing a seminar called the Hypertrophy For Functional Fitness seminar, where we talk about the application and utility, physiology, mechanisms, and methods for combining hypertrophy training with functional fitness and trying to really work both ends of the spectrum. Bridging the gap between performance and aesthetics is kind of our main tagline.
Well, that's awesome. We're going to talk about CrossFit today. We're going to talk about aesthetics and bodybuilding as well. But before that, going back to my initial question, talk about your move to Florida. What are the pluses and the minuses compared to where you were before? And maybe give us an idea of where you were before, what the climate was like, and where you are
Yeah.
now and how it changed.
Well, I've always moved around a lot, like since I was 18, about every 5 years, I was usually in a different part of the country or, in a different city. And that was just probably due to baseball and my athletic career. But then since then, we've kind of followed the same pattern where we lived, 5 years in San Diego and 5 years in Boston and 5 years in Colorado. And now we're down in Florida. And every place is wonderful. It has its own, unique flavor. But I think Camille and I like to keep things changing up. And we lived out in Colorado in this very pristine environment up in the mountains, very isolated is a good way to put it. And we loved living there for a few years. I think we lived there for almost 6 years. And then Camille got pregnant and we had our baby, and we realized it was not the best place to try to raise a child. So we started looking elsewhere, and we wanted to be closer to family. We wanted to be in a warmer place and maybe in a state that was a little bit more advantageous for our businesses. So we landed on Florida and found just an amazing home in Florida in a great town where we've already established a good foundation of friends and community. And we're loving it. But, every place we've lived has been wonderful. It's always, when we leave, the hardest thing for us always is not necessarily leaving the house or leaving the area, but it's like leaving our friends and the relationships that we've made there and moving on to that next phase. But that's who we are. We're always kind of evolving and trying to move forward, and so this has been a really nice move, and so far Florida has been a wonderful place for us.
That's really exciting. I've never been. Can you give me an idea of what I can expect if I ever set foot in Florida?
Well, Florida's got a lot of diversity, but where we are is a lot of beaches and palm trees, a lot of tan bodies, and very relaxed, very easy. Where we lived in Colorado, it was probably about 35 minutes to get to like the nearest supermarket. And where we are in Florida, there's like a supermarket like literally around the corner. Our daughter goes to preschool next door to our house. There's neighborhoods and families. So it's a lot more kind of populated and very much more like a neighborhood family feel. So yeah, and not to mention like, we love training. We have like a very robust home training facility where we've converted a tennis court into like a full-size gym. Nice. So love having people over the house to train and doing barbecues and pool parties and all kinds of fun stuff down there.
Yeah, the accessibility of different amenities is really such a huge thing, especially when you have a family. And I know that when we were in Vancouver, I had to commute down into town 45, 50 minutes every day and then back. The kid didn't go to school super close. And now I'm 7 minutes away from the gym. My kid walks to school across the road, like 3-4 minutes away. And we don't think about it, but those minutes add up at the end of the day. And it does make a big difference on your quality of life.
Yeah. And we're, both Camille and I are both in the prime working years of our life. So we don't have that much time to spare. We're trying to be the best parents we can be and the best business owners we can be. And also, we still compete and have our own fitness goals. So, before we were joking yesterday as we were driving around Colorado, we used to spend an hour and 15 minutes in each direction just driving to the gym, to get to the gym and work with the trainers that were training us and stuff like that. And now like we literally just like walk into our backyard.
Yeah, it's a huge difference. Do you feel already, or have you thought about the difference in maybe sun exposure that you might get in those two locations? Do you feel the difference? Is it important to you?
Definitely more tan, like we have friends here in Colorado and a lot of people we see even visiting Florida from the Northeast where we can instantly see like, wow, these people just don't get a lot of sun. So I think that's one of the things that we sometimes even forget in Florida is how lucky we are to be able to get regular sun exposure in a very temperate climate, and every day is very nice and comfortable. And sometimes you forget what time of year it is, because like it's Christmas, but you're outside in shorts and tank top. So, but we love that. And like I said, like we've always been the type of people where we live somewhere for a period of time and then we kind of move. Everyone's asking us like, are you guys going to stay there forever? And I'm like, I don't know, but right now it's amazing and we're going to ride it out and make the next best decision for the information that we have, but yeah, it's really fun and it's totally different. Colorado is a lot of pristine wilderness and just huge mountains. It gets really cold, but it's also super sunny and stuff. And Florida is hot. It has the ocean. It's kind of got this vacation kind of feel to it. So it's different.
It'll be interesting to see how the next few years go for you guys over there. I found out about you early on in the CrossFit days when you were doing videos with Rob Orlando. Can you tell us about how you got introduced to CrossFit first and foremost? How did that transition happen for you?
Yeah, sure. So I had just finished my baseball career and was, on the cusp of retiring, and I was trying to decide, like, do I want to keep playing ball or am I going to go and try to do something else? And I had a job in the off season training at like a very exclusive gym. It was a really cool gym in New York City called La Palestra, and it was home to a lot of high-end clients like celebrities, actors, entertainers, musicians, politicians, all that kind of stuff. And I based on that year of working there, I branched off and kind of started my own business with just one client who was beating my salary playing baseball, just training him. So I said, okay, maybe I'll just do that. And along that time, I always kept training, because I was preparing to go back and play. And one of the girls that I was training with was a former gymnast who hated that I would beat her in all like the strength stuff. So she found CrossFit and she said, hey, we're going to try this workout with like, squats and pull-ups and we'll see how you do then. And so we started kind of messing around with it, not knowing what we were doing until we got to the point where like, we need to kind of learn what this stuff is because we have no idea how to do these movements or how to do a squat snatch. Like it's hard for me to just teach myself. So at that point in time, this was in New York City, there was like one CrossFit gym in New York City called CrossFit NYC. And it was in the fashion district on like the 4th floor of an old beat up building. And I remember like walking up the steps and there were holes in the wall and like nails sticking out. And we get to this, what they were calling a gym. It looked to me like a meth lab or something, it was like just total mess. Everything was dirty, blood and puke on the floor. And we did this workout called Fight Gone Bad, which is, a typical CrossFit workout where you go through some high intensity intervals across a number of different stations. Mm-hmm. And the guys at that gym were like, oh my goodness, you guys are amazing. You need to compete at the CrossFit Games. And I was like, I didn't even know what that was. And they were explaining it to me. And I said, all due respect, guys, like, I'm a professional athlete. I'm not trying to be like the best exerciser in the world. I just do this stuff, for fun. And I don't really care about that. Anyways, fast forward, I decided not to go back and play another year. And it got around to summertime where I would have been in the midst of my baseball season. And I started getting the itch to try to compete at something. So I did a road trip out to California to visit some of my old teammates who were still playing ball, to watch them in their season. And along the way, I remembered that they mentioned there's this CrossFit Games event out there. And I thought, well, maybe I'll swing by and see what's up with it. Like
what year was that?
This was 2008.
All right. Second year.
Yeah. So 2008, I guess, what is that now? Like 14 years ago, I guess. Yeah. 14 years ago. So I drove up into California and I just loved like driving up the 101 and the top is down and like, the ocean's on my left. And it was an awesome vacation. And I got to this town called Gilroy, which is just a ranching town. And I was wondering, am I in the right place? And then I got to the location and it was like somebody's house. And I said, this can't be right. And so I drove up the driveway and I saw all these cars parked. And the first thing I noticed was that there were like all these Hummers parked there with gym logos on the Hummer. And I was going, how do these trainers afford all these fancy cars? Like, what's going on here? And so I walked up, there was a little gate in the front with a girl kind of taking tickets. And she looked at me and she said, hey, are you a spectator or are you a competitor? And I thought to myself, that's probably the deepest question anybody's ever asked me in my life. Like, are you a spectator or competitor? About it for a second. I said, I'm a competitor. I'm a competitor. I said, we're going to do this. I had no intention of competing, but when she that question, it was just so instinctive to me to like, no, I'm here to compete. So, so I ended up competing in the CrossFit Games. So like very limited experience doing CrossFit. I'd never really done most of the things. And so I kind of looked and tried to emulate what the athletes were doing. And it was so different than it is today, because like you could literally just like walk up and compete at the games. There was no prerequisite. There were these tables where you could like register for an event and you could pick what event you wanted to do first and when you would do it. So I did it. And while I was there, I was just meeting people, and I saw a lot of the athletes and coaches. I just recognized a lot of things in them that resonated with myself. Like a lot of them were former athletes. They all like to work hard. They were all interested in building their business, and they all like to kind of have fun and throw down. So I made some friends there. And one of the friends that I made was Dave Castro, the organizer of the games, who was nice enough to kind of sit there and talk to me. And I said, yeah, I used to play baseball and I'm just trying out this stuff. And he took me out to dinner. And he was like, come out to dinner with us. I want to introduce you to some people. And we went out to dinner with Greg Glassman and Mark Ripito and Mike Bergner. And I had no idea who these guys were. In fact, I thought that Coach Bergner was the owner of CrossFit, because he was the only one of those three that actually looked like a coach to me that I could recognize as a coach. The other people were just like, seemed like rambling, crazy old men, just like, rah, 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 just ranting off one-liners that were like riddles. And anyways, I competed in the games and I actually did really good. I finished 14th in the games, having no experience doing CrossFit.
Is that the year Kalipa won?
That was the year Jason Kalipa won, yeah. And then when I left, Dave was like, hey dude, like come to one of our seminars, I'll comp you a spot, come to level 1, like you're gonna really love doing this. And so I went back home to New York and I started like trying to figure CrossFit out a little bit and like do it on my own. And I had a good friend at the gym. I would rent out gym space for my athletes at the gym. And there was one of the trainers at the gym who, came up to me when I had my hands taped up because I tore them so badly at the CrossFit Games. I'd never done a kipping pull-up before, and they had like chest to bar Fran or something.
How heavy were you then?
I was probably somewhere around 200 pounds, that very normal looking kind of guy. And so she saw me with tape on my hands practicing kipping pull-ups, and she's like, why are you doing this? Like, your hands are obviously hurt. Why are you continuing to hurt them more? And I said, it's CrossFit. You wouldn't understand. And I showed her like a little video that I took on, it was like a little flip camera of the CrossFit Games. And she's like, oh, that looks kind of cool. And I was like, well, I'll show you a workout. Like, I'm just trying to practice a little bit. Like, I'll put you through a workout and we could do it together. And so we became like best friends, and her name was Denise Thomas. And now she's like a key player on the CrossFit HQ staff, but that's how we both found kind of CrossFit together. And after going to the CrossFit Level 1 and training my athletes, I was invited to do an internship with CrossFit, and that led to like a 10-year career teaching seminars. And I still competed in the CrossFit Games, for the next few years. I really enjoyed that, but I kind of started to gain the MO of being one of the stronger athletes in CrossFit, despite the fact that CrossFit's so diverse and strength is just one aspect of it. I already had exposure to strength training before that. So I came in already pretty strong. So I would like laugh at the weights, being like, this isn't even heavy. Like, I don't know why everyone's complaining, because most people just didn't have the same background I did. And it was the same for Rob. Rob and I competed together in North American Strongman, and we were two of the strongest 200-pound and under athletes in the entire East Coast, just like lifting up stones, doing axle bar presses and things like that. So we knew each other from Strongman, and I saw that he was like putting out some CrossFit videos. So I was like, hey dude, like let's film some stuff together. Like we can come up with some insane workouts that no one in the world will be able to do. So we were doing like 5 rounds of 5 deadlifts and 10 burpees with like 500 pounds on the bar. We would basically double whatever the weight was CrossFit was prescribing. We were like, let's double it, and so we started putting out those videos and submitting them to Dave and to CrossFit, and that gave us a little bit of a following. And then Dave, he's such a fan of the athletes. Like, he really, number one, is like just in awe of what humans can do, I think. And he wants to know the limitations. So he had this idea of like doing a road trip with Rob and I, where we would walk into gyms like work out with some of the other CrossFit Games athletes and just do like really strong stuff. And so that's what that CrossFit road trip was. But along the way, you probably saw that, you know, he and I both have a little bit of a personality. Like I like to push his buttons and have fun and tease and stuff. And he gets really serious and angry if he doesn't lift the weight he wants. And it was just the perfect dynamic. It's like, you know, it was like Laverne and Shirley, you know, like it's just and so that really gave us the most. I think that gave us a lot of like people like you and a lot of folks that kind of say like, hey Dave, I know you from CrossFit. A lot of them you know, saw me on that video series where we're just traveling up California, lifting weights and having fun and throwing down. And that's really kind of the coolest thing, I think, is like, not just like doing a workout, but the dynamic between athletes and the idea that like, there's a community here and a community of guys that like want to just like have fun and work hard. And so I think that resonated with folks. And since then, like, you know, the history's kind of written itself. Like I worked for CrossFit for 10 years teaching courses until I started kind of coming up with my own conclusions about fitness that didn't necessarily match up with the CrossFit methodology. And despite the fact that, you know, I tried really hard to almost like jockey for the opportunity to bring some new information into CrossFit, they were very much tied to their mantra and didn't want to do anything that, you know, Greg Glassman didn't necessarily say. So, you know, that information was not really allowed in. But, you know, after years and years of competing in CrossFit, I started getting injured like a lot of people, like my wife, like a lot of our friends, and ended up with a very serious chronic back injury that required surgery. And, you know, it was years of me suffering, trying to like heal my back and then go back and do more CrossFit until I realized that like, that's not the way. Like, you know, it's not about training harder, and intensity is not the cure all for anything. Like if your back is hurt, the answer isn't deadlift heavier. So after having back surgery, I thought, you know, I really love training so much. I've been giving this new lease on a training life. What am I going to do with it? And so I thought, well, you know, I love competing, but I probably shouldn't try to compete in CrossFit because that's just going to land me back on the surgery table. And I don't think that like strongman or powerlifting are necessarily the right match either. But I'd never really explored bodybuilding. And, you know, a lot of people say like, oh, I've done some bodybuilding before, but you haven't really done it until you've actually done it and competed in bodybuilding and understand the methods and the facets and the complexity of applying a specific type of stress and lifestyle to get your physicality to change in a powerful way, you know, like seeing somebody who you don't recognize because their body has changed so much and they've pushed the limits. And, you know, for a lot of people, I think that's where their training career begins. It's like they go into a gym and they stand in front of the mirror and they start doing bicep curls because they want to look like a superhero, or they want to get chicks or whatever it is. And I'd gotten completely away from that, where it was like just performance at all costs, like aesthetics is stupid. You don't need to do that. That's not going to help your deadlift. When in actuality, I didn't even really care that much about those things. Like I didn't really care about being the fittest man on earth or being the strongest guy in the room. I just wanted to like look awesome naked and be able to do lots of stuff, you know,
yeah, which is
athletic.
Which is probably, you know, what a lot of people seek out, you know, feeling good in your own body. I think that's something that's sometimes still demonized today. But I mean, in my opinion, it's a really healthy thing to like the body that you've, you know, crafted for yourself, that you've worked hard on, because we know that it's not easy to be fit, to eat well, to take care of yourself, especially in today's world where everything's going 2,000 miles an hour. We'll come back to the bodybuilding side. From your CrossFit days, why do you think, with hindsight, why do you think you got injured? Or do you have an idea what it was that drove that?
Absolutely. I think when people start doing CrossFit, it's really exciting to them. And it's exciting because they're learning functional movements and they're learning how to work with intensity. And a typical reaction for people after they do like their first CrossFit workout is they're like, wow, I've been training for a while and I feel like I've never really worked out before. And there's this huge kind of curve where they see improvement. It's called like the honeymoon period, where just by practicing functional movements and working, you know, a little bit harder, you see tremendous progress and increasing your capacity and your body changes. And then you get to a point where things start to plateau. And this is usually happening kind of like in the 1 to 2 year range after you start doing CrossFit, where you're not getting much stronger and you're not getting much fitter, but all of a sudden like little injuries start popping up. You're like, my shoulder's kind of weird and my back's kind of sore. And that's because you now have capacity to perform these movements in a way that you can actually injure yourself pretty good because you have that capacity. So lifting things as heavy as you can and as fast as you can continuously with your foot to the floor going on the red line is just a recipe for a disaster. And so I think it's really common to see athletes, once they have done CrossFit for a few years and now things are not really improving, you start to see that kind of plateau and that injury stuff kind of pop up. That's the same thing that happened with me, but I just ignored it. I just said, like, I'm just going to keep going and try to get a couple more inches here and there until it got to the point where I was on like a Ferris wheel. Like I'd injure myself, heal, and keep doing the same things, to get hurt and injure myself, and then even feel really defeated that like I can't do what I used to do, or I can't do what the other athletes are doing, or I'm not going to be able to compete in this sport again. When in actuality, I didn't even really care about that stuff deep down. That was just kind of peer pressure or things that were drilled into me, you know? So I think that's the main reason why people get injured doing CrossFit, not just me, but a lot of folks, because they don't understand how the body adapts, and the fact that that kind of intensity every day is really just a recipe for hurting yourself, or it doesn't allow for plateau. There are other things within the program as well, due to the repetitiveness of the movements and the frequency, because they say CrossFit is varied. And varied can be a nice way of saying random, but typically what you'll see is like stuff where, you know, you might do back squats on Monday and back squats again on Tuesday and maybe some back squats again on Thursday. And although they're different, you're still not allowing the body and giving it a chance to heal, not just from an orthopedic standpoint of allowing the tissues to heal and the micro tearing to heal, but even the hormones to heal, which is why beyond just the orthopedic injuries, I started to experience a lot of systemic hormonal suppression, things like lower thyroid production, lower testosterone levels, lower growth hormone levels, loss of body mass, all of these things associated with a lack of ability to properly heal. So, you know, I realized that things need to be a bit more thoughtful than that. You can't just go redline every day, and you have to have a plan, because if you don't have a plan, your plan is to fail. And everything you do in the gym should be on purpose with purpose, not randomized. So I think that's why I got injured, and that's why a lot of athletes get injured. So, you know, the answer to that was to rethink things and understand, yes, CrossFit has some really valuable utility and context, but it's not the end all. And if it's not prescribed properly, you're not going to be happy with the results. I think that's why the program sees a lot of attrition as well, where people kind of go through it and then they're like, all right, I'm done with this. You know, they no longer have that excitement they had when they first got introduced to it, because they're not seeing the same kind of progress, because they've outgrown that honeymoon period and now there's nowhere to go. And if your only strategy is putting on more weight on the bar or trying to go faster, you're really limited in your ability to be able to circumvent those issues.
Yeah. Would you say that in the early days when you, let's say, found and joined CrossFit, was there already that stigma? Because, and I'd love to hear your opinion on that, but from my perspective, there was, for I'd say many years in the early days of CrossFit, there was that almost demonization of bodybuilding or of any isolation movements, because quote unquote, they weren't functional. And if you look now, you know, any person that wants to compete at a serious level and that is putting in serious volume of training does this kind of work, because it supports the high intensity work. It supports all the different joints and muscles that are then going to be tremendously stressed in those different workouts. And like you said, all those patterns that we're doing over and over again, you're doing a thruster, you're doing an air squat, you're doing a back squat, you're doing a wall ball, it's all a squat. And sometimes you need to actually get out of that pattern, because you're going to overuse it and your joints and your muscles aren't going to be that heavy.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of thinking and rhetoric is just flat out false. And it has nothing to do with bodybuilding or CrossFit, because everything has context and utility. So if you say, hey, CrossFit's the only way, you're severely limiting yourself, because there's so many things that have value. And if, you know, that's the only, imagine like you have a palette of paint and you're limiting yourself to one color, you're not going to be able to paint as pretty a picture as if you have the ability to maybe contextualize this stuff for athletes, what their goals are and who they are, what phase they are in life and all that types of stuff. So like bodybuilding is not the end all, right? There's a lot more about bodybuilding. Any program by itself is just is limited, it's incomplete. So that's that's where I really enjoy kind of the hybrid model
Mhm.
of taking elements of CrossFit or powerlifting, bodybuilding, and even Olympic lifting, depending on the athlete, to be able to create not just a physical specimen, but someone that can do a lot of stuff outside the gym really well. And I think a lot of those arguments were kind of drawn in defensiveness because they felt that maybe CrossFit felt attacked. You know, a lot of bodybuilders don't want to do CrossFit. A lot of CrossFitters don't want to do bodybuilding. And that's just stupid because they both have so much to gain from each other.
Mhm.
When you're trying to protect it's like Donald Trump trying to double down on his statements. When you're so adamantly convinced that you're right, if you admit any part of your program or thesis could be wrong,
Mhm.
now everything is just shattered, and that's stupid. That's not how good thinking should be. Good thinking should be like, looking at what you're doing, being able to inspect where the areas are that you can improve, and evolving. Because if you're not evolving, you're dying. The way that I train now, even with Thundrbro, is still different than when I started, because you start to learn, and having that kind of growth mindset allows you to achieve great things. But if you don't do that, you'll find that you're stuck in the same place that you are where you started. So from a CrossFit perspective, the program really hasn't evolved much at all. And
Mhm.
that's why I think you're starting to see kind of almost like a leveling out or lulling of the program, because people realize that they want a little bit more, that there's maybe a better way to do things. And it doesn't have to be kind of all in. It's not a tribal mentality, right? You don't have to be like married, but we should be knocking down these fences and bringing as many cool things into a comprehensive program as we can to be able to improve its results, because no one's the same, and like I said, you're just really limiting yourself and your thinking and your growth if your answer to everything is that you're wrong, because you're never able to actually hear the feedback.
You talked about things that you wished to bring to CrossFit when you were still, teaching and evolving in that space. Could you spell out those add-ons or those modifications that you think were appropriate at the time, or thought were appropriate at the time, that maybe unfortunately didn't resonate with the people in charge?
Yeah, sure. A few years ago, I think it was almost 2016, the directors of training at CrossFit, Dave Castro and Nicole Carroll, approached my wife and I, Camille, they asked us if we were interested in developing our own course. And I said, yeah, I got a great idea for a course. We can call it Hypertrophy for Functional Fitness, or CrossFit Hypertrophy. It's like, how can you combine the elements of CrossFit with someone who's trying to increase their muscle size, or just strictly increase their physicality, or get more of the biological adaptations to just grow more muscle and fortify themselves? And they were like, what do you mean, like bicep curls? And I go, no, I didn't say bodybuilding. I said hypertrophy. And they said, well, they were not interested in it at all. They weren't even interested in hearing what it was. And I said, you know what? There's a lot more to this. I've been researching it on my own and doing a little bit myself after back surgery to kind of figure out how can I build myself back up without having to put maximal weight on my body. And I said, I'll do a journal article. The CrossFit Journal is kind of like the informational index for CrossFit, where people submit articles and they get them published. And I had a number of articles published with them before. And I said, let me write you an article about this so you can understand what I'm saying. And during that time, like, I had been collaborating with some of the best minds in muscle hypertrophy. One person in particular, Brad Schoenfeld, who has a PhD. He wrote a book called The Science of Muscle Hypertrophy. And I was lucky enough to get a hold of Brad and get to have some conversations with him and read his books and try to understand, like, where's the overlap and how can I combine this with functionality? And so I wrote this paper, and it started getting really long. And so at first I started with like, okay, let's start with muscle physiology and understanding a muscle cell, because as shockingly as it is, with the 17,000 gyms of CrossFit gyms around the world and the 100,000s of trainers, very few of them can tell you what a muscle fiber is or how it works, which is so silly, because you need to understand that stuff at a cellular level to be able to, number one, understand the training, and number two, have the confidence of your athletes that you know what you're doing. So I started with just getting into the physiology of muscle contractile theory. And then I started looking into some of the mechanisms that help muscle cells grow. What are the factors? And those factors are things like muscle tension, muscle micro tearing, metabolic stress. And then beyond those factors, getting into the mechanisms that that actually help that occur in the gym. So like, what are the methods you need to do to maximize muscle micro tearing or metabolic stress? What are the different strategies you can use, which are really, honestly, advanced bodybuilding concepts, the things that you see bodybuilders do: drop sets, isometrics, negatives, giant sets, overload eccentrics, all that really cool stuff. That's all directly correlative to what it's going to do to a muscle to help it grow. And then we started talking about, okay, well, what's the utility here? Well, in terms of performance, the utility is increasing the athlete's hardware so they can imply their very impressive neurology. It's a CrossFit. It's great at a couple things. CrossFit teaches athletes how to move really well and how their brain needs to communicate with their body. They're really good at cheating, right? They get very efficient at putting in the minimal effort to get the maximal effect. So the neurology is there, and where they're most limited is actually in their hardware. Their biological contractile potential is the biggest limiting factor because they already know how to use their bodies really well. So from that perspective, it was like, here's a huge performance benefit. For number one, if you want a bigger deadlift or a faster Fran time or whatever it might be, you're not limited in how well you can coordinate yourself. You just need a bigger, stronger body to work with to have more potential to use what software you already got going on between your brain and your muscles. The second big call to action to athletes was orthopedic safety, which was my background, right? Coming off of back surgery is like, hey, speed and load are the biggest players when it comes to injury. Hypertrophy is not about breaking yourself down, but it's about building yourself up, increasing the cross-sectional strength of muscles, the bone density, the tendinal strength, all that stuff where you can actually fortify the critical joints that experience a lot of breakdown, like knees, hips, and shoulders. You can spend a lot of time doing hypertrophy work for those really critical joints so that when you do put your foot to the gas pedal, you're more ironclad and resistant to injury. And then finally, the last argument was personal gratification. It's like 99.9% of people that are ever going to go in the gym are there for a derivative of the same two reasons. They want to look good and they want to feel good. So if they don't like the way they look or they're not feeling good because they're beat up all the time, you as a coach need to be able to manipulate their program so they're getting what they want. Otherwise, they're going to leave. So those were kind of the three arguments for what's the application and utility of it. You know, what's the science behind it? How do you do it? And then we talked about all different types of ways that we can overlay it, right? Like, how can we take something like the movements in CrossFit? And another thing we can do is, like, I was talking about the advantages of CrossFit. Yes, athletes learn how to move and use their bodies really well. So they know how to squat and deadlift and press and pull. They can do, kipping pull-ups till the cows come home. But they also understand intensity. They'll do pull-ups until their hands bleed. So all we need to do is take that stuff and channel it in the right direction. And they see huge improvement in their physicality and physique. And this is what's happening with a lot of our athletes online is they come from CrossFit and they've never trained that way because they understand how to move and how to work hard. They see dramatic improvement in a short period of time. So as a guy who's in his late 30s or early 40s or even 50s, for the first time, they're starting to see massive progress again, just like that honeymoon period we talked about when they start doing CrossFit, because now things on purpose, with purpose and strategy. There's a little bit more thinking behind it. And we still do CrossFit in the form of, high intensity exercise. But what I like to do is separate it from the hypertrophy training. The hypertrophy training is the point of the training where we're trying to break your muscles down and make you bigger and stronger. And the high intensity conditioning is meant to be conditioning. It's not meant to be more heavy weightlifting. So the heaviest possible or the really complex movements like squat snatches and muscle ups, those are not included in the program because they're more likely to hurt you. And what we try to do with our conditioning is keep it lighter and simpler to just practice good athletic movement patterns that are going to apply functionality outside the gym, but allow you to not get hurt and, have you feeling good. So that was kind of the main shift that I was trying to persuade people towards. But as I started writing this article, it started becoming so long as I got into things like orthopedic safety, and nutrition is a whole nother nut to crack because there's so many infinite levels to nutrition, which actually has a greater influence on your body's ability to transform than training ever will. And other things like, okay, what are the different ways you can program this stuff, depending on what you want and how fast you want it. This article ended up becoming 100 pages long. And so when I went to CrossFit to submit it to the journal, I said, hey, I've written this thing. It's really long. It's probably like a 5-part series or something. if I give it to you, would you own it? And they said, yeah, if you submit it, we would own it. And I just said, fuck that. I've put too much time and effort. I know you guys are not even interested in these ideas. So I'm just going to keep it and publish it myself.
Mhm.
And that was the first book I ever wrote, called Hypertrophy for Functional Fitness. And that was the launch of my company, Thundrbro, which is, here you go, guys. Here's how you bridge the gap between performance and aesthetics. If you're a CrossFitter and you're tired of getting injured and you want to have the body you've always dreamed of, this is how you do it. And it's a compromise between both of them. But very much so, it's a shift to about 75% of the program being hypertrophy work and only 25% of the program being high intensity conditioning work. But it allows athletes to be able to and capture the most athletes, getting them moving in the right direction where they're no longer getting injuries and their body is starting to change. And, I wish we could calculate the cumulative pounds of muscle we put in across the thousands of athletes we've worked with, but the results speak for themselves. The before and after pictures we have really speak louder than any argument I could ever make using my words. And so that's where we're at now. Our program has evolved a lot. We've come up with a lot of different offerings. I've written 8 books on training since then, all talking about everything from nutrition to different finishers you can incorporate after CrossFit workouts to, cutting programs, gaining programs with, dumbbells at home. But it's all along the lines of hypertrophy training and not being a display model only, being able to look good and feel good and use your fitness outside the gym.
It's really interesting that you mentioned 75% of hypertrophy work. Little note that I had here, and that's something I've been thinking about for a while. It's a simple heuristic, but I think it holds true. Hypertrophy is base. If you think of endurance sports, they do a lot of low intensity exercise, and that for many, many reasons, physiological, autonomic, and more, is going to support the high intensity work that they're going to then have to put in to compete at the highest level. And I guess the numbers line up with that as well. We talk about the 80-20 rule of 80% of low intensity work. At least that's what you see at the highest level in marathon runners or even track runners. And here you see about the same distribution between hypertrophy work, which is going to give you the foundation, not necessarily on the same exact level as endurance work will, but it does give you the foundation from the muscle standpoint to then tolerate that high intensity and look good in the process as well.
Yeah. And to me, that's awesome, is like being able to, it's a nice shift from CrossFit where they say check your ego at the door, but I think it's actually the opposite of that, because everyone is so egotistical about their score on the whiteboard that they're willing to forfeit their technique and they don't even give a shit about the training effect. They just want to make sure they have the fastest score. What's nice about the mindset shift is that all of our training is not about your score, how heavy the weight is. In fact, in CrossFit, the goal is to take a heavy weight and make it feel light and easy. With hypertrophy, it's the opposite. It's about taking a lightweight and making it feel really, really fucking hard. It's not about your score on the whiteboard. It's just about getting your muscles to a certain state so that you can adapt and progress. And having that pressure off is a huge relief, because now you can concentrate on your technique and know that there's tremendous value there. And as soon as you start seeing that improvement, it creates a monster. It has a snowball effect on athletes where they just want to keep going. And a lot of our athletes now, they don't even worry about their score. And it doesn't matter if you're the strongest guy in the room if you're not training properly. So if you're using things like momentum to lift the weights, momentum is the enemy of hypertrophy. You can be really happy with your heaviest lift while the other guys get way bigger and stronger than you. In terms of how to program, if most of our athletes were coming into the program at 250 pounds and 6% body fat, maybe it wouldn't be 75% hypertrophy training. But the vast majority of our athletes, where they have the most room to grow, is actually improving, number one, their body composition, but also their muscularity. That's where most room to grow. And seeing that is very gratifying. Building muscle is an awesome process. It's slow. It needs to be consistent. It needs to be methodical. It needs to be thought out. But it's the kind of thing where you go into the gym and you're excited to train. You're excited to make that progress because you're literally building yourself up. And you can see improvement for a lot of years. This doesn't end. There's no point where you're no longer going to get bigger. Sometimes the protocols need to change, especially the nutrition and the supplement protocols. But we have athletes that are continuing to improve into their 50s. So, there's a nice shelf life there where you don't start to see that decline, right? I was talking about that plateau or decline because now there's a lot more strategy physiology behind it. And we're all humans. We all have the same basic cellular anatomy. So, while the context and the details may change slightly from athlete to athlete, the main principles remain the same. And that's really cool to kind of see athletes improving and finding almost like you're rekindling their excitement for training again. They're finding a new life where they feel like they can win again in the gym and not walk away feeling defeated.
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. You mentioned the importance of muscle for all the reasons that you have outlined, but even from a health perspective, right? Muscle is alive, and as we age, we're going to lose muscle, and it's fundamentally important to stay strong in your later years, but to retain as much muscle mass and maybe even to build muscle mass, especially as you get a little bit older, because it's going to have such a tremendous effect on your quality of life. And the second thing was that you talked about building yourself up, right? Maybe it turns the focus inwards again, where a lot of the competitiveness of CrossFit, which again has its place, and maybe many people love that part of it, but it's very outwards driven, whereas bodybuilding is maybe more inwards driven, where it's you're working on yourself, and this is maybe a shift that was also needed.
Yeah, and if people have a desire to compete, there's always competing in bodybuilding, which I've done at the highest amateur level possible, and we have a lot of athletes that actually come from CrossFit and they're interested in doing their first bodybuilding. And I encourage athletes to do that, because if you're out there and you want to know how good you can look, doing a bodybuilding show is the best way to find that out, because there's nothing that's going to create a greater sense of desperation and fear than knowing that at a certain date at a certain time, you're going to be naked on a stage with a bunch of really fit, muscular athletes and a panel of judges looking to pull you apart. So the idea of being compliant with your diet or training, that's not an issue, because that fear is so motivating, especially if you've never done it before. Everyone's so afraid of looking silly or whatever. So it's a great way to find out what you have inside you. And even if you don't, a lot of our athletes are, like you said, so driven to compete against themselves, of trying to be better than they were and see that physical improvement, taking their body measurements, their body fat composition. In addition to those little things, what people saying, dude, what are you doing? Or you're looking this or you're looking that. It's really nice to hear those things. You don't really hear people say hey bro, that's a great looking deadlift. Nobody comes up to the supermarket to you and compliments you on your deadlift or your Fran time, but they will, grab you by the arm and be like, hey, well, you must be eating a lot of protein, bro, and while those comments are they can be a little bit weird or annoying sometimes, it is validation that you are, I always tell athletes, I know what you want. You want to be an outlier. You want to walk into a room and have people look at you and say, hey, that guy trains. You want to be go to the beach and humiliate the other dudes or girls at the beach. And that's what this is about, is having that kind of confidence. If you can look at yourself naked and love what you see, that gives you so much confidence in everything that you do in life, and vice versa. If you look in the mirror and you just are disgusted with what you see, or you feel discouraged, that starts to affect you in a lot of other ways too. So that's a huge part of the mentality of Thundrbro, is finding a way to win in the gym and not just surviving through life, but trying to thrive through it.
Before we talk about bodybuilding a little bit more specifically, what's your perspective on the evolution of CrossFit? Let's talk about the competitive side first. Since you got involved, like you said, you were there in 2008, so that was the second year, very, very early on. So what's your perspective on where it has come to today in 2022?
I mean, when I competed in 2008, honestly, CrossFit, because of the talent level of the athletes, it was nice and simple. The weights were very manageable. And I competed myself until 2013, at the CrossFit Games. My wife competed until almost 2020, and she had a 10-year evolution. And what we saw is that as the athletes improved, they kept on upping the ante, right? Making the movements harder, making it more complex, making it heavier. And this had an effect not just on the athletes at the games, but on the whole CrossFit community, where all of a sudden people started aborting the foundations and trying to go to the cool, sexy movement, trying to do muscle ups before they can even do strict pull-ups. And so I think that had kind of a negative effect on the program, because it started to move away from what it really was. When the program was there to have an athlete that could do basic things really well. The idea of virtuosity is doing the common uncommonly well, right? So they kind of aborted the common and let's go right to the really complex exceptional, and let's do the exceptional exceptionally well. But the foundations were kind of left behind. So that's how I saw it evolve over time. I would love to see a CrossFit Games that was a little bit simpler, where it was like, okay, run a mile, do Fran, do a 1 rep max deadlift, like just some simple stuff that literally anybody could do, as opposed to these really complex, intricate things, which are frankly less accessible, but I think send the wrong message to athletes, where it's like, that's not necessarily the goal, especially for you. Your goal is to be able to do basic things awesome, be able to crank out. I love push-ups, right? I think push-ups are one of the best upper body exercises, and we do a ton of push-up and push-up variations in Thundrbro. And if you're a dude and you can do 100 unbroken push-ups, I know that you got a steel chest that you could crack a walnut on, okay? You don't need to do any of the squat snatches or muscle ups. Like, that's not necessary, because I know you have the basic stuff absolutely down, but nobody does that. Everyone goes right to the sexy stuff they're seeing on TV. So yeah, I think that's how I've seen it kind of evolve from a program standpoint. From an athlete standpoint, we saw more athletes coming into the program that had previous athletic background, so they were entering in at a higher athletic capacity. And I think we also saw kind of the evolution of the sport, especially with the influx of performance enhancing drugs, where now there were like insane things happening, and the athletes that maybe weren't willing to do drugs kind of fell off, and the athletes that were really willing to push it started kind of rising to the top. And that's just natural for any sport where there's money on the line and fame on the line. It's going to happen no matter what. But because it became so big, you started to see a little bit of the influence of performance enhancing drugs there.
Right. Do you think CrossFit does a good enough job managing this and controlling for this with the testing and the way that they follow up on that?
Well, I think every organization chooses to do it differently. And I think sometimes it's like, it's good to say you have a testing program, but it's even better to be able to actually catch athletes. So for instance, the USOC does an amazing job with their testing program, right? They have a pretty advanced testing program where they're testing blood, urine, all kinds of stuff, doing randomized tests. With CrossFit, because athletes are all over the world, because of the financial restrictions, they just can't use that same level of testing, right? So there's ways to kind of circumvent that stuff depending on what you're taking or how you're taking it. An athlete overseas can take drugs for 11 months out of the year and then go and compete in the CrossFit Games. Is like not an issue. So yeah, I think that like they're doing the best they can, but that doesn't prevent it from getting into the sport, because with the way that they're using it now, it's kind of like an NCAA level of testing, where it's like, you know when you're going to get tested, number one, for most athletes, especially if you're overseas, at this date, you're tested at the regional, so get off your stuff. And there are also a lot of different compounds athletes can take that are just frankly undetectable, or they can take things at a sub-detectable level where they're just on a lower dose of this stuff. And that, I think the biggest question there is not necessarily of whether drugs are in the sport. Obviously, yes, it's in the sport. If anybody has a question about it, it definitely is. But it's more of like a moral decision for the athletes. Like, are they willing to cheat to be able to achieve what they want? And if you're willing to, you see things in the open where people literally doctor the video to change the clock or to put fake weights on their bar. Like, if you're willing to do that, they're absolutely willing to, take a performance enhancing drug. So it's not a question is if, it's just really like how they're doing it. I really respect the athletes that have always competed clean and have a strong moral ground with that stuff, because I think it's a different decision for some people. They don't really consider as much like the health implications of that type of stuff, which, if you abuse drugs, that's not good for anybody. But I think that's not the main concern for the athletes. The main concern is like, am I going to get caught, and how is it going to make me look, and how is it going to affect my following or my ability to make in the future if I'm a gym owner or a trainer. So I think that's the biggest deterrence. Is CrossFit tries to use humiliation tactics when it comes to that stuff by offering out severe punishments where they're going to publicize who you are and what you took and all this stuff, and trying to ruin your reputation. I think that's the biggest deterring factor for people, way more effective than their actual testing, which is very beatable, frankly.
Interesting. And yeah, for people who want to dig into that in sports in general, I'd recommend a documentary, Icarus, for those who haven't watched it, on Netflix, and then a little book written by Charlie Francis called Speed Trap, which is a fantastic display of what actually goes on in high level sports when it comes to performance enhancing drugs, and how common it is and how accepted it is in those circles. And I think for the general public who maybe doesn't have a good understanding of those things and still sees it as, oh no, in the sport that I follow, there's no drugs. I mean, it's really eye-opening when you start to hear from, the best in the sport and their coaches and how things actually work at those levels. So those are always good things to go and investigate for yourself. Dave,
there's also a really good Instagram handle called Anti-Doping Science that this guy
okay.
He does stories all over the world about how athletes are, what the testing programs are, how they're doing it. But I think from a CrossFit perspective, that my fear with this is that it gives kind of a misrepresentation to the people who follow CrossFit, who are looking at these athletes saying like, oh, if I train like this, maybe I'll look like them, when they don't realize that there are other factors there, you know, and they're wondering like, well, I'm doing the same thing, so why don't I look like this person or that person? Is because, you know, there's drugs involved.
So definitely follow that handle. I'll put in the show notes for those who are interested. Maybe just to finish off on CrossFit, if we talk about nutrition, I remember the zone diet when I started doing CrossFit, and I looked okay. I was probably a little skinny, and I was definitely dizzy getting off the couch. So I know that wasn't the best strategy at the time. How has your perspective on nutrition for CrossFitters changed since you got into bodybuilding, and what's the difference with what you would have seen maybe in years past?
Listen, I don't program nutrition for CrossFitters. I program nutrition for body transformation, right? And typically the athletes that are coming in to work with us are either there to, one, put on more muscle mass, so that would, you know, lend itself to a certain kind of nutrition protocol, or two, like, hey, I want to reduce body fat. Sorry.
No problem.
Did I lose you? Okay. So like, hey, I want to reduce body fat, and there's a specific nutrition protocol that would lend itself to that. You know, there's so many infinite levels to nutrition that you can really dive into that are just frankly untapped by most CrossFitters, because, you know, the bodybuilding community has really mastered the science. They understand what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat, all the different supplements and strategies you can use to manipulate things to get more muscle on or peel body fat off, or even do those things simultaneously. And with CrossFit, I think while, you know, starting with food quality, like, hey, let's eliminate processed food and things that can actually hurt you and cause metabolic syndrome. Like, let's just take that out of your cabinet first is a good place to start. There's a lot more to go. And when I talk about nutrition, really, I start the conversation by talking about the different signals in the body, specifically the anabolic signals, the signals that are conducive for building yourself up, accumulating muscle mass, uptaking nutrients, and catabolic signals, the signals that are going to actually break down muscle, that are going to cause you to atrophy, and those kinds of things. And oftentimes it's understanding what those signals are and the things that kind of correlate with them to develop the right protocol so you can kind of balance them together. You know, one of the biggest perspective changes I've seen kind of moving from bodybuilding to from CrossFit to bodybuilding is placing more importance on calories, because calories are king. You know, whether your food is clean or not, the amount of fuel intake that you're putting in your body is going to determine which direction your body's going, right? If you know, you're in a caloric surplus, you're going to be packing on weight. You might be packing on muscle, but your mass is going to increase. If you're in a caloric deficit, your body mass is going to be reducing. Yes, hopefully it's mostly body fat, but it can also eat away at some muscle. So, you know, we need to start with kind of the calories and the fuel inputs, because calories in and calories out, like, that is really the foundation. And that's where we need to start with athletes, and understanding their basal metabolic rates and where we need to start them in terms of calories. And then macronutrient balance can change. We typically have moved athletes away from very high fat diets, because a lot of them say like, hey, I eat paleo, and they're eating avocado and bacon and nuts and all kinds of like things. And I'm like, that's just way too much fucking fat. And you're actually undercaloried, you're slowing your metabolism and grinding it to a halt because you're consuming so much fat. So you've gotten to the point where, you know, you're relatively lean, but you're never able to get over the hump and actually get to a very lean state. It's hard to get under that 10% body fat because you're consuming so much fat. And, you know, carbohydrates too, that's another thing athletes don't realize, that there's a general fear of carbohydrates, but they're so valuable for building up muscle. You just need to contextualize it, you know, within a scope. Like there's a time and a place to be, you know, pounding, fast digesting processed food. That's not how you want to live, but there's definitely strategy there where it can be very conducive to muscle growth, where spiking your insulin can be very conducive to muscle growth. And then there's just like your baseline of, you want to eat generally healthy, clean most of the time. So, you know, for athletes who want to cut fat, typically we'll put them on a diet that's at least 40% protein, 30% carbs, and anywhere to 20 to 30% fat, depending on who they are. Typically, we try to keep them lower fat because they don't realize how much fat they're consuming in the food items that they're not calculating, because there's fat in everything. They think like they eat a piece of protein and like, oh, it's protein, but there's actually a lot of fat depending on the cut of protein that you're eating. And vice versa, when athletes are trying to put on muscle, we'll put them in higher carbohydrate diets, which will be between 40 and 50% carbohydrates, and a caloric surplus, which will range anywhere from 18 to 25 calories per pound of body weight per day in calories. So, if you're a 200-pound male and you're eating 20 calories per day, that'll put you on a 4,000 calorie diet just to get into a caloric surplus. Another important factor is protein intake, your nitrogen balance. And whether you're cutting or gaining, you want to be in a positive nitrogen balance. So either you have enough available protein to build up muscle, or as you're cutting, you have enough available protein to preserve what muscle you already have. So it's a little bit different than just like the zone, like it really goes to a whole nother level. And then there's things like, the nutrient timing. I was talking to you about those anabolic and catabolic signals. When you do something like a cutting program, we operate in an intermittent fast where athletes are doing fasted cardio work or even depletion work, which is basically like light weightlifting or cardio weightlifting, kind of CrossFit-y, but a little bit easier. And then when they go to lift, we start packing as many calories around their lifting session as we can so that they have the stores to actually uptake nutrients and synthesize that stuff, the protein, into muscle mass. And that's kind of strategically placing calories around the lift, where they may eat tons of carbs around their lifting despite the fact that they're cutting. And that's really effective for getting leaner and revving up an athlete's metabolism while helping them preserve muscle mass and still reduce body fat. So that's kind of the balancing act between anabolic and catabolic signals. When it comes to gaining muscle, there is no balancing act. We want you as anabolic as possible. So it's like lots of calories, lots of carbs, lots of rest, not a lot of conditioning, because conditioning is going to interrupt what we call the mTOR pathway, which is important for muscle hypertrophy. So that's where athletes say, hey, you're just not going to condition as much. You're just going to focus on lifting heavy, eating a lot of food, and sleeping a lot. And all of a sudden, we have athletes putting on 20 pounds in a month just by living the anabolic lifestyle. Because frankly, a lot of CrossFitters are under-caloried, under-carbed, but over-caffeinated, which makes them constantly catabolic. So they're never really able to put on muscle mass because of their lifestyle and the fact that they're like way too much conditioning to ever put on muscle. Like I said, conditioning is great for reducing your body fat, increasing your cardiorespiratory capacity. It's very effective for that. Conditioning is not very effective for putting on muscle. So if your goal is putting on muscle, skip the running workouts, all right? And just spend your time with heavy lifting volume and feeding as much as you can around it. And all of a sudden things start to change.
How did you decide to step into the bodybuilding world? You talked about your back injury and how that maybe pulled you away a little bit from the high intensity or just the nature of CrossFit in general and what it required to perform at the highest level. What was your interest in bodybuilding like at the start?
Well, I guess it started by realizing that there's a lot of fakers out there, right? There's a lot of people that say, hey, I do bodybuilding in my program, or I'm a bodybuilding coach, but they've never really done bodybuilding with themselves or with their athletes. In addition to the fact that for Thundrbro, we're not exclusive to CrossFitters. We want to bridge the gap between performance and aesthetics by pulling a lot of bodybuilders and mainstream populations in. So I realized that in order to do that effectively, I had already been around CrossFit. I already had a decent amount of credibility and visibility in CrossFit, where people knew who I was. They knew I was legit and that I understood that stuff. But on the bodybuilding side of the fence, I had no credibility at all. So I had to build that credibility by going and trying to understand it at the highest level so I could apply it to my athletes. And it started by me. I linked up with first an amazing gym out in Denver, Colorado called Armbrust Pro Gym. And it's the home of the 7-time Mr. Olympia champion, Phil Heath. In addition to the fact that it's just like a house of like 65 IFBB pros, coaches that have tons of years of experience. And I walked in there and at least said, hey, I'm a CrossFitter and I want to try some bodybuilding. I'm looking for a coach. And I linked up with a guy named Alan Watkins, who's like a fucking genius coach. He's been around forever. And I was at the bottom of the totem pole again, right? They didn't know who I was, and I had to earn my stripes and earn that credibility. And since then I was able to do so. And now I go in there and I feel like I'm one of the boys, and, they understand that, like, I've gone from 200 pounds to 250 pounds at 5% body fat. And like, I've been able to do it myself and prove that I understand what it takes not just doing it with me, but doing it with our athletes. And what I did is I took those concepts and I tried to distill them down to the layman, right? Maybe the person who's not necessarily looking to compete at bodybuilding at the highest level, but maintaining the principle and applying it to someone who maybe a dad or mom who has a job, who's training kids, has an hour of a day to train. And how can we take that very extreme approach, like the same way, like, okay, like competing in the CrossFit Games, it's very extreme, but it's not for everybody. In fact, it's probably for like, not for 99.9% of people, but there are still things in there that we can apply to context of the average Joe who's just doing this to look good and feel good. And I started creating systems with it. And the systems I created were our 30-day shred challenge system, which is our body fat cutting system, and our muscle mania system, which is our mass gaining system, in addition to our muscle anarchy training program, which is like the coolest fucking training program ever, that just takes all these advanced bodybuilding concepts and overlaps them on top of functional movements and minimal equipment, just barbells and dumbbells. And now we're like, okay, let's see what you guys can do, just doing things a little bit smarter and a little bit more strategic, like I said, on purpose, with purpose, in a way that's been proven at the highest level. So that's why I got into bodybuilding. Yes, I love competing. Yes, I love, every time you get on stage, you're going to be better than the last time you were. And it's a slow process, where the first show I did, I was like 208 pounds on stage. The next show I was 225. The next show I was 230. The next show I was 242. So you kind of see incremental improvement over years. And that's always fun personally, to kind of see like, hey, I'm 40 years old and I'm in the best looking shape of my life. Like, this stuff really works. But I need to be able to prove that, not just with myself. In fact, it's less important for me to prove it for myself and more important for me to prove it in my athletes. So being able to show the breadth and depth of impact of your protocols. What that means is being able to show a lot of athletes and dramatic transformations. And so that's what we've done, is like, we've just spent years collecting these before and after pictures of people, so that, no matter what I say, whatever kind of science or semantical debate you want to get in is completely trumped by results. Results are king. So you can't argue with a before and after picture in terms of the efficacy of your program. And that's the most important thing to do. But yes, I had to compete and go all in myself and understand that at the highest level before I could go back and actually create those systems. So yeah, it really is hardcore bodybuilding, delivered to the mainstream athlete who wants to also be able to run a 10K and play with their kids and do all the other fun athletic stuff. Because physical culture is not just about how you look. Physical culture is about being able to be a virtuoso across all expressions of physicality. So I wouldn't want an athlete to not be able to run a mile just because they want to look good. That's not Thundrbro. Thundrbro is about having both together.
That's awesome, man. What are the first things that you learned when you start diving into bodybuilding, into all the details, learning the science? Is there anything that surprised you off the bat, or that some light bulb moments that you experienced early on?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for understanding, especially coming from CrossFit, is like, from a training perspective, is actually slowing down, and slowing down and feeling muscles contract and understanding the value of tempos and not being afraid. You can really destroy yourself with a light weight. And I was under the fact like, oh, go heavier, put more weight on the bar. And I can't hold the tempo and I can't really hold that rest period, but I can do more weight, because I was still thinking about my score on the whiteboard.
Mm.
And the big shift, like letting go of that and just thinking about training effect on muscles, and, just annihilate, getting muscles to the point, however you do it, getting muscles to the point where you're flirting with failure is where adaptation happens. So you can do that a number of different ways. But like I said, it's not just about finding a way to make a heavyweight feel easy. It's about taking lighter weights and making them really, really hard. And when you're doing that, that's when you really tend to respond. Okay. And the other thing I realized is just rest, right? You need to have a very strategic training split when it comes to breaking down muscles. So for instance, at Muscle Anarchy, we train legs, chest, back, shoulders, and arms on a 5-day rotation respectively, where they have one leg day on Monday that absolutely annihilates their legs. And they're probably limping around till about Wednesday with some delayed onset muscle soreness. But by the time the next Monday comes around, their tissue has had the time to heal and remodel and grow thicker, and they feel ready to train legs again. So more is not better. Better is better, and better is defined by results. So oftentimes, athletes, like, they're so addicted to going to the gym and working hard. They just want to train more and more and more, but that's not really their quickest path to those results. So in some ways, it's pulling back and understanding the value and context of recovery, investing in nutrition. Now, everything I eat is so meticulous. I know exactly how many calories and what my macros are. Even if I'm off season, I know exactly what I'm supposed to be eating and why I'm eating it. So it's not quite as off the cuff of like, I eat paleo and I try to, not stay away from processed food. Like, that's fine. It'll get you to a certain point, but it really won't get you beyond it. So you need to be really strategic and progressive with your diets. And when I say progressive, you might start a diet. Let's say you're doing something like the 30-day shred challenge. You might start a diet at 2,700 calories. And over the course of that month, you might work down to 2,200 calories, because the same way you need to push in the gym, putting more weight on the bar, doing more reps and expressing more capacity, you need to push to improve. It's the same thing with nutrition. You need to incrementally be pushing your body to adapt to either a more and more of a caloric deficit or more of a caloric surplus to be able to continue to see improvement. Otherwise, you level off, and that's the end of the progress. So, you need to keep pushing. When I'm gaining, right, we'll do the Muscle Mania challenge, and I do all these things myself with the athletes. And like, you might start the challenge at like 4,000 calories, and 3 months later, you might be eating 7,000 calories. But you've given the body time to adjust to that ability to process and utilize the food. And I'm not just going to start someone at 7,000 calories and have them shitting their brains out and force feeding themselves, because that's just going to be sloppy weight. You need to have a progression with nutrition the same way you need to have a progression with your training.
Mm-hmm. If we talk about organizing goals around bodybuilding, besides, and I guess that is one of the main goals, but if we talk about the physique, are there other intermediary goals that you might set, whether it's looking at volume per week or loads on certain exercises? How do you quantify the process of training for bodybuilding if it's not just for the physique that you might get out of it at the end?
So we use progressive overload. We want to see incremental improvement over time, but I do things a little differently with our style of bodybuilding than you might see with like typical bodybuilders, because one of my main concerns is performance and injury prevention. So, if you're a bodybuilder and you're taking a bunch of steroids, you can probably stick with the same 3 lifts and see improvement, incrementally, just pushing your calories and food for a really long time. But what I do is I do more undulating periodization, right? And undulating periodization means every week things are changing. The lifts are changing. So our main lifts have infinite variations, where one week, you might see a deficit deadlift. The next week might be a rack pull against bands. The next week might be something like, a sumo style deadlift. But we keep changing things up, and we work on about a 6-week rotation across our main lifts, where the next time you see a certain kind of complex or a certain lift, it might be 6 weeks later, but we want to be stronger, right? So we're kind of attacking it from all angles as opposed to more of a linear periodization model. I think the undulation really helps us with 2 things. Number one, it helps us with plateau, because as you get used to a movement and a movement pattern, your body creates the point where it's just comfortable and it doesn't feel the need to improve or change because it's not different enough. So undulating is a great way to avoid plateaus. And the other thing is it's great for injury because of the vast diversity of the movements, the patterns, the planes, and the angles that we're hitting. So it's able to kind of really, any kind of weakness will be addressed because we're using so many different variations of basic capacities that it creates a really well-rounded individual.
Another topic I wanted to talk with you about here to end the podcast is, I guess, the business side of Thundrbro. A lot of trainers, a lot of coaches out there are, working on their brand, trying to build their businesses, doing what they love, coaching people, whether it's in person or through remote programming or through selling programs online. What were the main steps that you've taken to get to where you are today? What, in hindsight, what are the most important things for a coach to put into place over the long term, developing their business if they want to be successful in what they're doing?
Well, Thundrbro happened by accident. I didn't mean it to happen. It was just me kind of sharing my story and my journey with people. And then, I wrote that book and people would be like, this book is awesome. How about a program with it? And I said, okay, I'll write a program. So I wrote a very basic program called the 90-Day Get Huge program, which is like the introduction to hypertrophy training. And it's what I used after back surgery, where we lifting 40% of your 1 rep max loads with tempos and truncated rest periods and higher volume. And I was like, wow, this worked really well. Even though I couldn't really lift heavy weights, I put on a ton of muscle. So this is a great place for maybe an athlete who's new to training or an athlete coming off of injury to start, just to be able to develop a base of good muscle mass. But then as I progressed, I started getting introduced to all these awesome different methods and ways of training that I could like translate to a barbell. I said, we need a little bit more advanced program. That's where Muscle Anarchy came in. And I just wanted people to share it with them. One thing I can see with our programs is that you have to kind of have a very specialty niche and you have to be really good at it. So, don't try to be the best at everything, but pick the things that you're kind of uniquely talented or have unique knowledge of and try to be the best within that scope. If I tried to be an Olympic lifting coach and a powerlifting coach and a bodybuilding coach, I'd probably end up doing all of them not so great, but I just focused on the idea of performance and aesthetics. That was it. And I think that resonated with people. I was shocked, actually, when we launched Thundrbro, I was so worried that like, oh, we're spent all this money on a website and to print these books and maybe nobody's going to buy them. And like we sold out in the first half hour. So it was apparent to me that there's a huge hunger here for this type of information and training. And then as I kind of grew and brought new things in, it was just all about what are the different ways we can support that message, whether that be the training gear, right? We developed things like heel wedges and wrist wraps and bands and things that can integrate with the training, whether that be nutritional systems, right? It's like, okay, training's great. And that's usually about 1 hour a day, but you have 23 hours of the day to fuck that up. And if your nutrition actually has such a greater impact on your body transformation than the actual training, we really need to be able to explain this nutrition, which is incredibly complex in a simple way to people, to create systems so we can handle lots of athletes. So yeah, for someone who's new to training, what I would do is like, see if you can come up with a specific niche or message that differentiates you from a lot of the other fitness people out there and just try to be really, really fucking good at it. And then the last thing is, our focus is never on dollars coming in. That's never the focus. Our focus is on the breadth and depth of impact of our athletes. So I've underpriced every single service we provide because I want as many athletes into the program. I never want to see an athlete leave because they're like, hey, I can't afford this anymore. But I want to be able to capture as many of those before and after transformations and have that be the priority of just impacting the athletes. And as a byproduct of that, people see what's going on and you end up with lots and lots of people. At this point, we have 10,000 athletes that are doing Thundrbro. We started with like 20. And so like, it's just a matter of really doing a great job with your athletes and fostering a strong community where your bottom line is them, right? Your bottom line is how good can I get you? How do I have the ability to impact your life in such a dramatic way that you want to tell everyone about it? And people are going to be like, what are you doing, dude? That's the bottom line. And the dollars come later. So I wouldn't focus on pricing and sales and deals and maximizing profits. It becomes important. Yes, you got to make money, but the bottom line has to be your athletes. And for me, it's the breadth and depth of impact where I want as many athletes as possible doing Thundrbro. Even if for our 30-day shred challenge, we offer training and personalized nutrition coaching and 3 ebooks with like meal plans and, talking about nutrient timing and supplement plans. We offer that for $99 where most people would probably offer that for $500 to $1,000. But I don't want just like 1 or 2 athletes each month doing it. I want to have hundreds of athletes every month doing that shred challenge so we can show the impact that it has.
And that's great advice. So you've gone from professional baseball, you've gone to a high level in the early CrossFit world as well. Now bodybuilding. Are there any sports or disciplines that are on your radar for maybe years to come, 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line? Anything you want to explore or dive into later on?
Yeah, I mean, well, following the mantra of Thundrbro, it's just like competing in bodybuilding is great, but like that's just like one thing to compete in, right? I also love doing all kinds of stuff. So like my wife and I, we like running, like we're gonna do a half marathon. We love to go biking. I don't think we'll ever compete in CrossFit again because our bodies just can't handle it. But yeah, like we love using our bodies and trying different things and like picking a new challenge. The underlying, like we mentioned before, like the underlying constant, the foundation of all our athletic endeavors is muscle hypertrophy. So I always want to be able to, like, whether it's a marathon competition or a powerlifting competition, I always want to be able to pop my shirt off and have people do a double take and be like, what the fuck is that guy doing? But, I think that's what's really cool about it, of having the physicality and the ability to perform in any arena. That to me is like exactly what we're about.
Dave, where can people find out more about your programs and about what you do?
So our main site is www.thundrbro.com. So it's THUNDRBRO.com. It's like Thun Dr. Bro, because it's about, bro science meeting real science. So that's, you can find all of our subscription training programs, all of our challenges, all of our ebooks, our gear, our apparel, that's all on there. You can find me at Dave freaking Lipson. I put out a lot of informational content. We actually run seminars. So we run the Hypertrophy for Functional Fitness seminar. You can find that on the main site. Our Thundrbro handle is at Thundrbro. And we're always very responsive. So if somebody has a question about training or hypertrophy, bodybuilding, CrossFit, nutrition, whatever it is, feel free to DM me. I always get back to people. And if I don't know the answer, I can definitely point you to someone smarter who maybe knows. Those are the best places to find us.
Yeah, I can testify to that. I DM'd you, and we made it happen on the podcast. So thanks so much for taking the time from your busy schedule to come on the podcast and share everything with us. It was a real pleasure, man.
Thank you so much, Sean. It was awesome. Thanks for having me on. And, the best to you and all your viewers. You got a really cool podcast going on. Should have come on sometime and do one in French, because I know that
that'd be great.
We have now, we have a lot of athletes all over the world, frankly, but a couple months ago, we had two of our shred winners. So these people who competed in that big group challenge with like hundreds of athletes. Well, they were a brother and sister combo who did it together from Quebec, Canada. And we did an interview with them, and Cami was interviewing them in French. And sure enough, now we have a ton of like Quebecois coming in, it's like, they understand that we're cool. So, come, you should do one in French for her, because people need this information all over the world, and language should never be a deterrent for being able to get access to great information.
Agreed. Well, let's make it happen. Thanks so much, Dave.
All right. Thanks, Sean. I appreciate you, brother.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, please take a few moments to leave a written review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want to watch this episode again, you can find the full video recording on my YouTube channel. You'll also find hundreds of hours of free content, all my podcasts, my thoughts of the day, structured presentations, and more. So don't wait, go subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.